In looking at the context of this speech, it is clear that Malema discusses the emotive and political issue of land reform. He then says that he is willing to go to prison for occupying land, but not for corruption. He then talks about the history of colonialism and apartheid, where land was unjustly dispossessed from the black majority. And it's at this point that he makes this statement. He talks about the colonialists especially slaughtering Africans, for example, in the Eastern Cape and so forth, and that's where the word slaughtered comes from. So although the statement may be construed as hurtful by a white audience, we need to look at the context and identify both the target group and identity of the utterer. The white group remains socioeconomically powerful. In contrast, the audience of the group that this statement was directed at remains largely poor and landless. We also need to remember that hurtful means severe psychological impact. If we apply an objective test and we ask what the reasonable listener would make of this, we have to, of course, think who is the reasonable listener in the South African context. So the reasonable listener would be a member of the black majority. The reasonable listener would have listened to the entire speech in its context and would have recognized that the topic of the speech was land reform. The historical context in which a statement is made is one of unjust land dispossession by both colonialists and the apartheid government. Reference to slaughtering is made in this context. The social context in which the statement was made is one of continued landlessness, poverty, and inequality, giving rise to anger and frustration by the black majority. The statement should thus be read bearing in mind the Supreme Court of Appeal's caution that we need to provide that space for the expression of anger and frustration at continued social injustice in our society. The factual context of the statement shows that the subject of the statement was not perpetrating harm against white people. That's not what the speech was about. It was about the highly emotive and contested issue of land reform. The statement calls for the peaceful occupation of land. Mr. Malema explicitly states that he is not calling for the slaughter of white people. And subsequently, not at this speech, but subsequently, he clarified that and emphasized that not under my leadership will I call for the slaughter of white people. However, given the continued skewed distribution of land going to the center of identity of black persons, land being central to dignity, he cannot guarantee what will happen after him. So viewed in its context, the statements deal with the subject of land dispossession and redistribution and is not aimed at inciting harm to white people at some indeterminate time in the future. The addition of, at least not for now, is of course crucial. And here, if one looks at section 16.2b of the Constitution, we also don't protect the incitement of imminent violence. Now, clearly, by not calling for the slaughtering of white people and not foreseeing a point of time when this will be called for, there is no imminent threat. The position is the same at international law in that there has to be a likelihood or risk of imminence of a threat of incitement arising. Incitement is a call for action. Malema explicitly says we are not calling for the slaughter of white people.